So, Dungeon Masters, have you ever had players get so off topic during a game that you paid a professional musician to write a song about it? That story, along with tips for DMs and players on today's episode of the Local Disaster Tour Guide. Hello everyone and welcome. My name is Mark and I am the Local Disaster Tour Guide. Yes, that's right. I'm your run-of-the-mill Dungeon Master, except it's okay, I was not planning on using those session notes anyways. I'd like to welcome you to the second video in my series, The Irrefutable Laws of Storytelling. This is a series where we look at some of the stranger, more peculiar behavior that is common at role-playing games. We dive into the psychology behind those behaviors, and we talk about ways that we can improve our games and tell better stories with one another. Today, we're going to talk about a common complaint that Dungeon Masters have for their players, which is the tendency to get way off topic during a game. So let me set the scene. The title of this session was Murder at the Festival. And I want to emphasize, my players knew that that was the title of the game session. They arrive at town, and in the Coins District, the merchant district of this city, a massive summer festival was just beginning to come together. There were all sorts of incredible foods that the players could taste. There were musicians of every sort scattered around the district for the players to interact with. There were games aplenty that the players could compete in. And since this was a great festival, every politician of renown, they were going to be there. Let me ask you, what do you think happened at this game? If your answer is the party attended a festival and they had to investigate a murder, I'm sorry, you clearly do not think like any of the players at my gaming table. It would be far too complicated for me to tell you the entire story, but let's just say that one player of a Vampire Magus failed in their attempt to steal magic from a wizard, and they were in a hurry to leave town. And another player, pulling open a map of the island that this city was on, discovered that there happened to be mountains to the north. Well, it didn't take long for the map wielder and the desperate to get away from the guards vampire to come together and to decide, let's all go to the mountains. My players left the city, took off to the mountains, and began exploring a region for which I had exactly 0 notes in my actual notebook. I had to throw open 8 different books with a number of different monsters and weather and random encounters to try to pull together something for my players to do, because I was not prepared at all for a trip to the mountains. My players randomly encountered a cloud giant, and then randomly stole a really powerful, life-draining sword from that cloud giant. My players were having a grand time with this adventure, while I was running back and forth like a madman, trying to figure out what on earth could be happening and what on earth could I possibly do to keep this game session together. Now, I will tell you, this is actually one of the most famous stories at our gaming table. We recount this story and we laugh about this story a lot. And I will say this, my players may have driven me crazy that day, but when they got back to town the next session, I got my revenge. Turns out that the vampire father of that particular player was the one who committed the murder, and that player had just accidentally framed themselves for a terrible murder. And now they had to solve that murder with the entire town guard gunning for the party. So this session is a very famous session for my gaming group, and we love to laugh about and joke about this session. In fact, this session was so famous at my table that I actually reached out to Dan the Bard and I asked him to write a song for my group about that session. And now, anytime that my players go gloriously off the rails during a game, they just sing "Let's All Go to the Mountains" while doing so. You know, it seems to be a rule for role-playing games that player characters have a natural allergy to anything that the Dungeon Master actually planned for this particular session. Why is that? Well, today we're going to talk about that a little bit. We're going to dive into the psychology of that behavior, and we're also going to offer some tricks and tips for dungeon masters and for players to help address this behavior and hopefully tell some better games together. So let's ask ourselves, why do players do this? Why do they get so off topic so easily in role-playing games? Well, as a dungeon master, I think that the answer to this is very obvious. Players are naturally adverse to anything that the dungeon master has prepared because if the dungeon master prepared it, it has stats. And if it has stats, it can kill a player character. Clearly, out of a sense of self-preservation, the party must avoid what the DM has prepared to keep their character safe. And by avoiding whatever the DM prepared, that gives them the opportunity to force the DM to make random loot rolls, which they can use to improve their strength, so that when they do get back on topic, they will be more capable of defeating whatever monster that the DM had prepared for them. Okay, let me just say, clearly that is not the case. That is an exaggeration for the sake of humor, but it is a real complaint for a lot of dungeon masters, and it has been a problem at a lot of tables that players do have a tendency to go rather off the rails. Well, I think that there is a very good explanation for why this is such a common behavior at role-playing game tables. And I'd like to talk for a moment for a very famous personality type study called Bartle's Taxonomy of Player Types. Some of you may have heard of this, some of you may be hearing about this for the first time, but Bartle's Taxonomy was actually originally applied to video games. And to the dungeon masters out there, I highly recommend that you go and look up some material on Bartle's Taxonomy. Even though it was written for video games, I think it is very applicable to pen and paper role-playing games. There's a lot of good material on the subject out there, and I'm just going to skim the surface real quick. According to Bartle's Taxonomy of Player Types, there are 4 types of players in video games: killers, achievers, socializers, and explorers. Now, really quick, killers is shorthand for competitive players. They enjoy games when they have an opportunity to compete against other players and to rack up as many wins as possible. Achievers are often driven by the goals inside the game. If you think about the achievements that you can score that pop up on player profiles in a lot of games, that is the kind of thing that drives the achiever player. The socializer player, they really don't care a lot about the game. They mostly care about getting to do something with their friends. And then the 4th type of player is the explorer. The explorer gets drawn into the game world itself. They see this vast and incredible creation that has been made, and they just want to see every part of it. Now, I know that those were some very brief descriptions, but I think you can hear a lot of role player tendencies inside those descriptions. And today we're going to talk specifically about the Explorer as it applies to pen and paper role-playing games. I'll admit that on Bartle's Taxonomy, the Explorer type is actually one of the types that applies to me a lot. I remember when I used to play World of Warcraft that I would just spend large amounts of time exploring the map for fun. I wasn't really doing quests, I wasn't really doing raids, but I did manage to accidentally wander into raid bosses on a couple of occasions because I just thought it was fun to see what was out there. That's what explorers do. They want to see the world and they want to see every part of it. I think you can take this type and apply it to pen and paper role-playing games. If an explorer is someone who wants to see what all is out there, tell me what world could possibly be as expansive as a pen and paper role-playing game. Our RPGs are as wide open as our imagination, and it is fertile ground for the explorer player to run and have fun. And that's why I think that a lot of players can get so off topic so easily in our games. Their imagination wants to know what's around the next corner, and it's all too easy for them to ask you, hey, what's going on over there? So when we talk about player behavior, it would be really easy to focus solely on the negative aspects of what our players are doing at our table, but that is not my intention here. Let me just say, when it comes to explorers throwing our games off the rails, frequently, I think that's actually a good thing. That story that I shared about let's all go to the mountains, honestly, it was very stressful for me as a storyteller. It was very difficult to keep up with just every piece of chaos that my party was giving me that day. But at the same time, after that game was over, that was one of the best nights of gaming my group has ever had. We still laugh about it. We loved that story. Even though my players went very off topic, we still had a lot of fun. I believe that explorers have a lot to offer our games. In fact, I believe that explorers do two very important things for us as a storyteller. Number one, explorers give us the opportunity to improve our skills. No other kind of player is going to challenge you as much as an explorer. But if you want to improve your skills as an improv storyteller, if you want to improve your ability to describe a scene and to respond quickly to what your players are doing in game, explorers are going to be the people that give you that opportunity to grow as a DM. Also, I think that explorers are the most important world builders at our gaming table. If we think about role-playing as collective storytelling, explorers are naturals for that. Yes, we have rules and books and dice and those different elements of the game that we're playing, but explorers are the people that really bring the most when it comes to collective storytelling as part of the hobby that we enjoy. So I believe that explorers actually bring a lot of wonderful things to the table. Still, any player type taken to an extreme has the potential to ruin a game. And so we do need to think critically about how we can respond to this kind of behavior so that we can ensure that our games are as good as they can possibly be. Dungeon Masters, I have a couple of tips for you. Number one, let players push your boundaries, but also know when you need to enforce a boundary. And number two, don't be afraid to apply the logical consequences to your player character's actions. Let's talk about these real quick. Number one, know your boundaries, but also know when to enforce your boundaries. Dungeon Masters, it is okay to say, I can't handle this. I've been storytelling for 2.5 decades. I have a lot of improvisational skill as a storyteller, but I very much remember the days when I didn't have those skills. And there was a large portion of my career as a storyteller where if my players had gone to the mountains, the game would have just fallen to pieces. We're never going to grow as storytellers if we're not willing to step outside our comfort zone. But if you step too far outside your comfort zone, you're going to lose the ability to tell a good story. If you study education, there's actually a concept called the zone of proximal development. I know that sounds like a fancy phrase, but basically what it means is there is a line for students, and anything below that line is too easy. And there's another line for students, and anything above that line is way too difficult. If you're too low, your students, they're going to check out. They're going to be bored. If you're too high, they're going to be frustrated and they're just going to fall apart. In between those lines, it's challenging, but it's doable. Know where those lines are for you. Know when you've reached the point where you're frustrated and you can't manage it anymore, and just be willing to say to your players, guys, we need to dial this back. I can't keep going. I can't keep up with this. It is okay to do that. There is nothing that says that you as a storyteller have to do something that you can't handle. You have permission to look at your players and say, guys, I can tell that you enjoy this, but I'm not ready for this. Let's go back to the other story, and I promise I will prepare for this another day so that you can chase this rabbit trail. Let players push your boundaries, but also know when you need to say, I can't go any farther. The second thing that I want to say is this. When your players go off topic in your stories, don't be afraid to apply the logical consequences for them doing that. Going back to the story that I told, Murder at the Festival was the title of that session. When my players wandered off into the mountains for the equivalent to several days in game, the murder still happened at the festival, and when the party got back, the consequences were far more severe because they weren't there to address the situation when it happened. Sometimes as DMs, when our players go off topic, we just kind of freeze the story that was happening over here, and let me say, don't do that. If they weren't there in the moment that they were needed, apply those consequences, let those consequences take place, and let the story develop naturally from there, because honestly, it heightens tension and it makes the characters' actions feel like they have consequences. So don't be afraid to apply the logical consequences of the characters' decisions to the story. Let me talk to the players who really fall under this explorer archetype according to Bartle's taxonomy. You have a responsibility in helping to make sure that the games that you participate in go well. And you have a responsibility to make sure that your fun isn't hindering the fun of other people at the table. Now, I could talk a lot about being mindful of the other players at the table, and that is definitely part of this conversation. If you're chasing a rabbit trail and it's really obvious that the other players want to get back to the story, let that rabbit trail go. But I also want to talk to you for a moment. Explorers, please be mindful of your DM. The farther off topic you go, the harder it gets for them to tell a good story. And eventually you're going to reach the point where you're asking for a story that just is not going to come out well. I want to encourage you to think a little bit about what is occurring on the DM side of the screen and to be aware of what is happening with them. I have a couple of tips for you. Number one, pay attention to how your DM is reacting to your actions and respond accordingly. Number two, it's okay to ask to revisit things later. So let's talk about these real quick. Number one, pay attention to your DM and respond to them accordingly. If you're chasing a rabbit trail and the DM seems to be having a genuinely good time, keep going. Have fun. Explore that and see what creative things that you all come up with together. It is completely okay to chase that rabbit trail as long as your storyteller is doing okay. But if you can tell that your dungeon master is getting stressed or frustrated, if you can tell that they're having a hard time keeping it together, be respectful of that and back off of that story. It is very easy to think of a way to get back on topic. For example, let's say you've gone to the mountains and you're enjoying exploring those mountains. But you look over and you realize that your poor storyteller is at his wit's end. It's really easy to get that game back on topic by saying, hey guys, these mountains are more than we can handle right now. Let's go back to town and get some supplies, and we'll come back later and explore all of this. Congratulations. You've left that thread open, and your DM can go back to those precious notes that they actually wrote for this session. If you see your DM struggling, have enough awareness to say, I have a responsibility to back off so that I'm not frustrating another, honestly, I'm not frustrating another player at the table. My second tip is this. Realize that you have the ability to influence the game world outside of the game. It is okay to ask to revisit something at a future date. In fact, I love it when my players do that. I will frequently ask my players questions such as, are there specific monsters you really want to fight? Or are there specific kinds of stories that you really want to do? Or is there a particular dungeon that you really want to explore? And I love it when my players come to me and say, I really want to do this, or I really want to fight that, or I really want to know what's happening in this part of the world. I write that stuff into my stories all the time. So if you're an explorer and there is a part of the world that has really caught your interest, it's okay to talk to the DM outside of the session and say, hey, this is something I really want to do. And I promise you, as a storyteller, we can find a way to work those things into our games. So let's review. Today we've talked about the tendency for players to get off topic in our games. We've talked about the psychology of why this happens. Specifically, we discussed Bartle's taxonomy of player types, and we focused in today on the explorer personality type and how it applies to role-playing games. We've talked about some of the positive things that the explorer personality type can bring to our games. We talked about how explorers give dungeon masters an opportunity to grow. They challenge us and help us to learn improv and help us to improve our skills. We also talked about how explorers are natural world builders and how they bring life and vitality and interest to the worlds that we are creating together. We also talked about how the explorer personality type can be frustrating in a game, especially for dungeon masters, and we offered some tips to dungeon masters. We talked about knowing your boundaries. Know when something is challenging and doable, but also know when something is frustrating and falling apart, and be willing to ask for players to step back so that you can manage what's happening on your side of the screen. We also talked about applying logical consequences when players go off the rails in our games. Not freezing the story, but letting the story play out so that our players feel like their actions have real consequences, and using those moments to add extra tension to our games. We also talked about some player tips. If you're an explorer, we talked about being mindful of how your actions are affecting other players and how they're affecting the DM. Watch the other players, watch the DM, and if your actions are frustrating them, step back and be willing to revisit those things that have captured your curiosity at a later time. We also talked about how you can influence the game world not just in game, but out of game. If there's something that you really want to do or something that you really want to explore, go to your storyteller out of the game and talk to them about it out of game and give them an opportunity to write those things into the game. I believe that every player has something fantastic to add to our gaming groups. And I believe explorers really do bring a lot of creativity and life to the worlds that we are building together. But let me ask you, what is your favorite story of a time that your group went completely off the rails in a gaming session, and how did that story play out? Let me know down in the comments below. Also, do the other YouTube stuff, like the video, subscribe to the channel, share the video if you enjoyed it, and let's keep this conversation rolling. I'm Mark, the local disaster tour guide, and may your next game be a critical success. Have a wonderful day.
A dungeon master was running a game and the party came to a town. Well, a really big city, actually, Absalom and Golarion. 'Twas a festival, he set the scene with lots to see and do. Merchants, games, activities, not to mention the food. There was Angelus and Eloise, Belgian, Kira, Gabriel, Cronius and Longinus, but the rest weren't there. Oh well, then Angelus mugged a wizard, trying to drink his blood like a fountain. Then they all decided, let's all go to the mountains. Let's all go to the mountains. Let's all go to the mountains. Skip the hooks and the boring plot. Let's all go to the mountains. So they went to the mountains north and had a really good time, while the DM scrambled through his books and told them what they'd find. A cloud giant, and then later their cave they found a life-stealing sword, rescued a wormling blue dragon from a band of minotaurs. While they wasted time, there was still an ongoing plot, you see. The vampire father of Angelus, he was getting thirsty. He was not caught, no he was not, when he killed a noble dead. The witnesses blamed Angelus, and they wanted him instead. Let's all go to the mountains, let's all go to the mountains. Skip the hooks and the boring plot, let's all go to the mountains. A few days stroll, the party came home. Angelus was on a wanted poster. For the murder, Angelus was blamed. He looked just like his father. 100,000 gold pieces, that bounty was quite awesome. A random group of paladin bounty hunters stalked them. That's what you get when you skip plot hooks. There's no point lamenting. That's what you get when you all decide, let's all go to the mountains. Let's all go to the mountains. Let's all go to the mountains. Skip the hooks and the boring plot. Let's all go to the mountains. Let's all go to the mountains. Let's all go to the mountains. Skip the hooks and the boring plot. Let's all go to the mountains.
Hello everyone, this is Mark and the post-credits volunteer shout-out. Today I would like to talk to you about donating blood. I wanted to share a little bit about my experience of becoming a blood donor. Growing up, I was always terrified of anything medical related and anything needle related. There are several stories from when I was growing up and I would pass out in science class and other places because I have just always been weak-stomached. But several years ago, I came to an important realization that I was not donating blood because I was afraid of needles. And I realized that I was letting fear control my actions. And so there came a point where I just said to myself, I have to donate blood at least once because I have to tell myself that I am not going to let fear control my actions. So I gathered a group of people together. I needed the moral support, went down to the facility and donated blood for the first time. And as I was getting into the chair, My best friend and future wife, Marie, looked at me and said, "Mark, if you're the universal donor, you know you're going to have to keep doing this, right?" I've never quite forgiven Marie for what she said that day, but I can tell you I've been donating blood quite regularly ever since. Donating blood takes about 30 minutes. The team at the facility, they know what they're doing. They're very professional. They have dealt with people who are afraid of needles and don't deal well with medical stuff. They know how to handle those situations. If you're nervous, I promise you that they know how to take fantastic care of you during the donation process. And even a single donation of blood can save multiple lives throughout the community. If you're looking for a way to impact the community, this is a fantastic opportunity. Right now, with everything that's happening with the COVID-19 situation, you probably can't just go into the facility and donate blood. What you will probably need to do is call ahead and schedule an appointment to donate blood. They have a lot of restrictions and safety protocols that they're doing to keep you and other donors safe. But if you want to respond to the medical crisis that our communities are facing, this is a very easy way to get involved, and I promise you it is very rewarding. So let me encourage you. If you've never considered donating blood, maybe now is the time to give it a shot. And beyond that, let me just encourage you, look for opportunities to volunteer, look for the opportunities to bless your communities, and look for those opportunities to change the world. Have a fantastic day.